Hey guys, we think we know the story of the Titanic, but what actually happened on the deck that night is a lot different than the movies. Today, cruise ships have strict safety drills and radar. Back then, they drove full speed into the dark and didn't even know how many lifeboats they had. Some of it was just bizarre. Passengers actually played with chunks of the iceberg that fell on the deck. The ship's band played ragtime music while the front half of the boat went underwater. Many passengers refused to get in the lifeboats because the sinking ship felt warmer than the air outside, and the crew physically locked gates to keep third-class passengers trapped below deck. I'm just a guy reading stories, so subscribe if you want to stay for the ride. Where are you listening from tonight? Let's start from day one at the docks. Southampton was a madhouse on the morning of April 10th, 1912. If you were standing on that dock, the first thing you'd notice wasn't the luxury, it was the scale. This ship was like a skyscraper that somebody decided to tip over and toss into the water. Most people had never seen anything that big in their lives. You're standing there with your bags, and depending on how much money you have in your pocket, your morning goes one of two ways. If you have a first-class ticket, you basically just stroll on. You walk up a covered gangplank, a steward takes your coat, and you're in. It's like checking into the best hotel in London. But for the folks in third class, the experience was totally different. You didn't just walk on. You had to wait in these long, slow lines. You had to go through a health check before you even touched the ship. Doctors would stand there and look at your hands and your face. They were looking for lice or eye infections. If you looked sick, they'd pull you out of line, and you were done. You didn't get on the boat. You just watched your life savings sail away. Once you passed the health check, you grabbed your bags and climbed up the side of the ship. Now think of the Titanic like a big floating sandwich. The layers tell you exactly who is important and who isn't. If you were rich, you lived at the top. Decks A, B, and C were the place to be. You had the sun, you had the breeze, and you had the view. Your rooms were huge. Some of them even had private decks, so you could look at the ocean without having to see any other people. You had elevators, which was a massive deal back then. Most people had never even seen an elevator, let alone ridden in one. You'd step into a little cage, a guy in a uniform would pull a lever, and you'd just glide up to the dining room. But as you go down the stairs, the money starts to disappear. By the time you get to the bottom of the ship, Deck G and lower, you're in third class. This was a totally different world. Down here, you aren't looking at the ocean. You're looking at the inside of the hull. You're deep in the belly of the boat. To get around, you had to use these long, narrow hallways. One of them was so long and straight that the crew called it Scotland Road. It ran almost the whole length of the ship. If you lived down there, you shared a room with people you didn't even know. Maybe you're a guy from Ireland and your roommate is a guy from Sweden. You can't understand a word he says, but you're sharing a bunk bed for the next week. In third class, you didn't have a private bathroom. You had to walk down the hall to find a sink. And if you wanted to take a bath, good luck. There were only 2 bathtubs for all 700 people living in third class. You had to plan your whole day around trying to get into one of those tubs. Movement on the ship was strictly controlled. This is the part that's hard to wrap your head around today. You couldn't just walk from the bottom of the ship to the top to see what the fancy rooms looked like. There were gates, actual iron bars and heavy doors that stayed locked. The ship was designed to keep people in their place. Part of that was because of the law. The U.S. government was really worried about poor people bringing diseases into New York, so they made the shipping companies keep the classes separate. If you were in third class, you stayed behind the gates. You stayed in your section. You didn't see the grand staircase or the fancy cafes. You saw the white-painted steel walls and the pipes running along the ceiling. You could feel the ship down there, too. Up top, it was quiet, but in the bottom of the boat, you heard everything. You heard the roar of the coal being shoveled into the furnaces. You felt the vibration of the massive engines right through the floor and into your teeth. So you've got your bags, you found your bunk, and you figured out which stairs lead to the tiny piece of deck where you're allowed to stand. You're settled in. The whistle blows, the tugboats pull the ship away from the dock, and you're finally moving. You're heading for the open ocean, thinking you've made it. You're on the safest, most expensive ship in the world. You've got no idea that the very layout of this boat, the gates you just walked past, and the stairs you just climbed, is going to decide whether you live or die in a few days. But for those first few days, nobody's thinking about survival. They're thinking about breakfast. You wake up on Thursday morning and the ship is humming. There is a steady vibration under your feet that you stop noticing after an hour or two. If you're in first class, a steward knocks on your door and brings you hot tea. You get dressed in your best clothes. You have to. You can't just go to a meal in your pajamas. That's not how this works. You spend 20 minutes getting your tie straight or pinning your hair up because everyone is watching everyone else. You walk down to the dining saloon. The tables are covered in thick white linen. The silverware is heavy and shiny. You eat your fill of eggs, bacon, and even grilled kidneys if you're feeling fancy. Then you head out to the deck. This is where the real social game happens. You walk, you do laps, you nod to the millionaires and talk about the weather. If you're a woman, you might sit in a wooden deck chair and let a worker wrap a heavy wool blanket around your legs. It's chilly out there, even when the sun is hitting the water. Now, if you're down in third class, your morning looks a lot different, but it's just as busy. You don't have a steward. You get yourself out of your bunk, which you're probably sharing with 3 other people. You head to the dining hall, and it's loud. It smells like cooked oatmeal and wet wool. You eat your porridge and talk to the person sitting next to you. They might be from Sweden or Ireland or Italy. You're all headed to the same place, looking for the same new life in America. After you eat, you head to the back of the ship. That's your space. It's called the poop deck. You can't go forward to the fancy areas, and you definitely can't go up to the higher levels. You stay in your zone. You watch the white water trailing behind the ship and smoke a pipe. Around midday, some of the wealthier passengers head to the wireless room. This is the big new thing. It's called the Marconi room. Think of it like the 1912 version of sending a text message. Inside, the air literally crackles. There's a constant snapping sound, like electricity jumping between 2 points. That's because the operators are tapping out Morse code. If you have the cash, you hand over a slip of paper with a message. You tell your mom you're having a great time. You tell your business partner to buy certain stocks. It costs a fortune. It would take a regular worker a week of labor just to send a few words. But the rich love it. They think it's a miracle. They're in the middle of the ocean, and their words are flying through the air at the speed of light. They don't know the guys running the machines are exhausted and overwhelmed. They just want to show off that they can talk to the world from a moving boat. But while you're walking around, you start to notice the rules. They're everywhere. You see iron gates at the top of the stairs and at the ends of the hallways. Most of them are locked. These aren't just there to keep people from getting lost. They're physical borders. The government actually had laws about this.
They didn't want the people from the cheaper cabins mixing with the rich folks because they were afraid of spreading diseases.
It sounds mean, and it was. If you were in third class, you never saw the grand staircase. You never saw the gym or the heated swimming pool. Your world ended at a piece of iron lattice. You didn't really complain about it, though. That was just how the world worked back then. You knew where you belonged, and you stayed there. The day follows a rhythm that feels like it will never end. You eat lunch, you take a nap, and you walk some more. In the afternoon, the band starts playing. If you're in second class, you might go to the library to read. If you're in first class, you head to the smoking room to drink brandy and talk about politics. As the sun starts to go down, the ship lights up. Thousands of light bulbs turn the Titanic into a glowing city on the water. Dinner is the main event of the night. In first class, it's 10 courses. You start with oysters and end with fruit and cheese 2 hours later. By the time you're done, you're stuffed. You take one last walk on the dark deck, look at the stars, and go to bed. You do the exact same thing the next day. It's a perfect, boring routine. You feel safe. You feel like this ship is the most solid thing in the world. But while you're feeling safe in your bed, the world outside is changing. Sunday starts like every other day. You wake up, you eat breakfast, and you take a walk on the deck. But under the surface, things are starting to get weird. The bridge, that's where the captain and his officers work, is getting messages. They call them Marconigrams. Other ships nearby are seeing ice, big ice. A ship called the Corona sends a message at 9 in the morning. They say there are icebergs and field ice ahead. Captain Smith reads it. He posts it on the bulletin board for his officers to see. It's not a huge deal yet. Ships see ice in the North Atlantic all the time. You don't know any of this. You're just enjoying your lunch. By lunch, another message comes in from a ship called the Baltic. They're warning about ice in the exact same spot the Titanic is headed. Smith takes this one to Bruce Ismay. Ismay is the big boss of the company that owns the ship. He's a passenger, but he's really the one in charge. Ismay just puts the warning in his pocket. He doesn't seem worried at all. He wants the ship to go fast. He wants to show the world that this boat can get to New York ahead of schedule. He doesn't tell anyone to slow down. Now, you have to understand who is running the radio on your ship. It's two young guys named Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. They don't actually work for the ship. They work for a separate company called Marconi. Their main job isn't safety. It's sending messages for the rich people on board. You want to tell your family in New York that you're having a great time? You pay these guys to send it. They're swamped. The radio equipment actually broke down the night before, so they have a huge pile of personal messages to catch up on. They're tired, they're stressed, and they're busy making money for their boss. Around 1:40 p.m., a ship called the America sends another warning. It says they just passed 2 big icebergs. This message never even makes it to the bridge. Phillips and Bride are just too busy sending happy birthday notes and business updates for the first-class passengers. They just stick the ice warning on a metal spike on their desk and keep working. They don't think it's their priority. As the sun starts to go down, you notice something. It's getting cold. I mean, really cold. Usually the ocean air is chilly, but this is different. By 7 p.m., the temperature drops 10 degrees in just a few hours. It's freezing. Most people stay inside where it's warm. The heaters are turned all the way up.
You're probably sitting in the dining room enjoying a massive meal. In first class, they're eating 10 courses. People are laughing, drinking wine, and talking about how fast the ship is moving. You can feel the engines vibrating under your feet. The ship is pushing hard through the water. Up on the bridge, the officers know it's cold. They know there's ice out there, but they don't slow the ship down. That's just not how things are done back then. If the weather is clear, you keep going at full speed and you just look out for the ice. The problem is, the ocean is like a mirror tonight. There are no waves at all. Normally, waves hit the base of an iceberg and create white foam. That's how you see them in the dark.
But tonight, the water is perfectly flat. There's no wind, there's no moon. It's just pitch black. At 7:30 p.m., another warning comes in from a ship called the Californian. It's a smaller ship nearby. They say they're surrounded by ice. This message actually gets to the bridge, but Captain Smith is at a dinner party being held in his honor. He's the star of the show. He glances at the warning and goes back to his meal. He's been a captain for decades. He thinks he can handle a few pieces of ice. By 9 p.m., the temperature is 33 degrees. That is just 1 degree above freezing. Most passengers are finishing up dinner. Some go to the smoking room to play cards or have a drink. Others head to their rooms to get some sleep. You might be one of those people. You climb into your bed, pull up the heavy blankets, and feel the steady hum of the ship. It feels like a giant warm house. You don't have a care in the world. You think you're safe. At 9:40 p.m., another warning comes in. This one is from a ship called the Mesaba. They report a huge field of ice right in the Titanic's path. This is the most important message of the whole day. It's a direct stop now kind of warning. But Jack Phillips is alone in the radio room. He's exhausted. He's trying to send messages to a station on land. He hears the Mesaba, but he doesn't write master on the top of the note. Without that code, the note just sits on his desk. He's too busy trying to get through his pile of work to realize how important it is. Then, at 11 p.m., the Californian tries to call one more time. They've actually stopped their ship because the ice is so thick. They're just sitting there, waiting for morning. Their radio operator, a guy named Cyril Evans, calls the Titanic. He says, "Hey, we're stopped." Phillips is annoyed. The Californian is so close that the signal is incredibly loud in his headphones. It's literally screaming in his ears while he's trying to listen to very faint signals from far away. He snaps. He taps back a message that says, "Shut up." Evans on the Californian waits a bit. He's been on duty for hours and he's tired. He figures if the Titanic doesn't want to listen, that's their problem. He turns off his radio at 11:30 p.m. and goes to bed. On the Titanic, you're probably asleep by now, or maybe you're just nodding off. The ship is still doing 22 knots. That's almost top speed. The lookouts are up in the crow's nest, staring into the blackness. They don't have binoculars because they were lost back in England. They're just using their eyes. It's quiet. It's cold. Everything feels normal. But the ship is heading straight into a trap that everyone else has been trying to warn them about all day long. You're moving at 25 miles per hour toward a wall of ice, and the only man who could have warned you just turned off his radio. So there you are. You're in the middle of the North Atlantic, and the one guy who could have told you what was coming just went to sleep and turned off his ears. You're on the biggest ship in the world, and you're moving at 25 miles per hour. That doesn't sound fast when you're in a car, but when you're moving 46,000 tons of steel, it's a lot of momentum. You can't just stop that kind of weight on a dime. It takes miles to slow down. And right now, you don't even know you need to. Up in the crow's nest, two guys named Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee are shivering. It's nearly 11:40 p.m. The air is so cold it hurts to breathe. There's no moon out. The water is like a mirror, totally flat and still. Usually you'd see waves breaking against the base of an iceberg, which makes a white foam you can spot from far away. But not tonight. Tonight the ocean is dead quiet. Fleet is staring into the haze. Suddenly he sees something. It's not white. It's a black shape, darker than the night sky around it. It gets bigger and bigger every second. He doesn't hesitate. He reaches out and grabs the rope for the big brass bell. He hits it 3 times. Clang, clang, clang. At the same time, he grabs the telephone that connects him to the bridge. A young officer named James Moody picks up on the other end. Moody doesn't panic. He just says thank you and hangs up. He turns to the officer in charge, William Murdoch, and repeats the warning. Murdoch reacts instantly. Hard a starboard! He's trying to stop the ship and turn it left at the same time. Now here's where things get tricky. In 1912, when you said hard a starboard, it actually meant you wanted the ship to turn its nose to the left. The helmsman, Robert Hitchens, grabs the spokes of the big wooden wheel and spins it as fast as he can. You have to imagine the stress he's feeling. He's standing in the dark, and he knows something massive is right in front of them. He's waiting for the ship to react. But a ship like the Titanic doesn't just dart out of the way. It's like trying to turn a skyscraper. For about 30 seconds, nothing happens. The ship just keeps moving straight toward that black mass. Fleet and Lee are up in the nest, holding on tight, waiting for the crash. They're looking down at the bow, watching the point of the ship. Finally, slowly, the nose starts to tilt to the left. It looks like they might actually make it. The front of the ship clears the ice. It looks like a narrow miss. But then it happens. If you were a passenger sitting in the first-class lounge or laying in your bed, you didn't hear a big explosion. There was no giant boom. You didn't get thrown out of your seat. Most people didn't even notice anything was wrong. One guy later said it felt like a heavy finger dragging along the side of the ship. Another person said it sounded like someone was tearing a long piece of silk. It was a low, grinding scrape. It wasn't a head-on crash. The iceberg hit the side of the ship, under the water, and just rubbed against it for about 7 seconds. That 7-second rub changed everything. As the iceberg scraped along the side, it was so tall that it reached up over the deck. Huge chunks of ice, some as big as your arm and some much bigger, snapped off the berg. They didn't fall into the water. They fell right onto the ship. Specifically, they landed on the forward well deck. This was a spot where third-class passengers liked to hang out to get some fresh air. At that time of night, there were only a few people out there. They were just walking around or smoking, trying to stay warm. Suddenly, this wall of ice slides past them, taller than the masts. Then they hear the thud, thud, thud of ice hitting the floorboards. Imagine being one of those guys. You're standing on a ship everyone says is unsinkable. You hear a weird noise, and then suddenly the floor is covered in white chunks of ice. You didn't feel a crash, so you aren't scared. You're just confused. A few of the guys walked over to the piles of ice. They picked it up. They started talking about how weird it was. One group of passengers actually started a game of soccer with the bigger chunks. They were kicking them back and forth across the deck, laughing. Some people got even more creative. They picked up handfuls of the ice and took it back inside the ship. They went into the smoking rooms where their friends were playing cards.
They walked up to the tables and dropped the ice down. They told their friends to put it in their whiskey. They were joking around, saying they'd found a way to get a cold drink without waiting for a waiter. They had no idea that while they were playing games on the deck, the water was already rushing into the mailroom and the boiler rooms down below. They didn't know the iceberg had sliced a 300-foot gash in the side of the hull. To them, it was just a little bump in the night and a bit of ice to play with. They thought they had a funny story to tell when they got to New York. They stayed out there for a few minutes, breathing in the cold air, totally unaware that the clock had already run out.
So, there they were. They thought it was just a little bump. They were joking around. But inside the ship, the vibe was changing fast. The crew knew something was wrong. Not all of them, but enough of them. They started hitting the hallways. Imagine you're finally asleep. You've had a long day of walking around the deck, eating fancy meals, and maybe having a few drinks. You're tucked into a warm bed in a room that cost a fortune. Then, out of nowhere, there's a loud, heavy thudding on your door. It's not a polite knock. It's urgent. It's annoying. You pull the covers over your head, but the knocking doesn't stop. That's how it started for hundreds of people on the Titanic that night. The stewards were the ones doing the legwork. These guys were usually there to bring you tea or brush your coat. Now they were walking down those long carpeted hallways, hitting every single door. They were telling everyone to get up, get dressed, and put on a life belt. But here's the thing. They didn't tell everyone the ship was sinking. In fact, many of them didn't even know it themselves. They were just following orders. So you can imagine how that conversation went. A steward tells a wealthy passenger to put on a bulky, ugly cork vest and stand outside in the freezing night. The passenger looks out the window, sees nothing but flat, calm water, and says no thanks. They thought it was a joke or some kind of annoying midnight drill. They weren't about to leave their calm cabin for a drill. A lot of people actually got into shouting matches with the crew. They'd open the door just a crack, look at the steward and tell him to get lost. They complained about the noise. They complained about the cold air coming in from the hallways. One woman actually told the steward that she wouldn't come out until she had finished her hair. People were worried about their jewelry and their clothes, not their lives. And you can't really blame them for being skeptical. The ship wasn't leaning yet. There weren't any alarms going off. There were no sirens or flashing lights. It was just a guy in a uniform telling you to do something that sounded really inconvenient. To a lot of people, the biggest threat wasn't the ocean. It was catching a cold. The stewards had to get creative. They started going into rooms and literally pulling people out of bed. They'd grab the life belts off the top of the wardrobes and throw them at the passengers. They'd tell them to just put it on to make the captain happy. They told them they could come back to bed in 20 minutes. That was a lie, obviously, but it was the only way to get people to move. Even then, some people were stubborn. They'd put the life belt on over their silk robes, walk out into the hallway, see how cold it was, and then turn right back around. They went back into their rooms and locked the doors. They figured they'd just wait it out. They thought they'd wake up in the morning, the crew would apologize for the wake-up call, and they'd have a funny story to tell at breakfast. In the second-class cabins, it was much of the same. The stewards there were even busier because there were more rooms to cover. They were running from door to door, yelling for people to hurry up, but the passengers were confused. They kept asking what happened or if they hit something, and the stewards would just say it was nothing to worry about, just a precaution. That lack of honesty made people think it wasn't a big deal. So they took their time. They picked out their best coats. They packed little bags. They acted like they were going on a short stroll instead of fleeing a dying ship. For the people in the nice rooms, the biggest problem was the temperature. The air on the Atlantic that night was like ice. Every time a door to the deck opened, A blast of freezing wind would whistle through the hallways. People would feel that chill and immediately decide they were better off inside. They argued that the ship was the safest place to be. It was a giant floating palace. Why would you leave a palace to sit in a tiny wooden boat on the freezing water? It didn't make any sense to them. So they sat on their beds, they talked to their friends, they laughed about how silly everyone looked in those cork belts. They waited for someone to tell them it was all over so they could go back to sleep. They didn't realize that while they were arguing about being tired, the front of the ship was already getting heavy. The water was moving in, room by room, deck by deck. The stewards were getting more desperate, but the passengers were still stuck in a state of denial. They thought they were just being inconvenienced by a crew that was overreacting. They were choosing their warm blankets over their only chance at survival. They didn't know that the floor they were standing on was already starting to tilt. By the time they realized the stewards weren't joking, it would be a lot harder to get to those lifeboats. It wasn't just a drill anymore, but for many, that realization was coming far too late. So those people who thought it was all a big joke were in for a rude awakening. Gravity doesn't lie. And by now, the Titanic was starting to tell a very different story through the soles of everyone's feet. If you've ever walked down a steep ramp, you know that feeling in your knees where you have to lean back a little just to stay upright. That's exactly what started happening on the ship. It wasn't some sudden lurch that knocked everyone over. It was a slow, steady lean. The front of the ship, the bow, was getting heavy. All that water rushing in was pulling the nose down into the ocean. At first, you might have thought you were just feeling dizzy. You'd look down a long hallway and think the floor looked a little off. But then you'd see a door swing shut on its own, or you'd notice a rolling suitcase start to drift toward the front of the ship. That's when you'd realize the whole world was tilting. Down on the lower decks, things were moving way faster than they were up top. I want you to imagine the mail room on G deck. This was a busy place. The Titanic was officially a Royal Mail ship. That's what the RMS in its name stands for. There were 5 guys working down there, 2 Brits and 3 Americans. They had about 3,500 sacks of mail to look after. When the Titanic hit that iceberg, they didn't run for the lifeboats. They did their jobs. They saw water pouring in and started dragging those heavy, soaking wet mail bags up to a higher deck. Can you imagine how heavy a wet sack of letters is? It's like trying to move a bag of cement. They were working in freezing water that was already up to their knees, then their waists. They were panting and struggling, trying to save people's letters, while the ocean was literally filling the room. It didn't take long before they had to give up. The water was just too strong. It was coming in through the hull and rising so fast that the mailbags started floating around them like giant corks. The lights down there were probably flickering, and the sound of the water must have been deafening. They realized then that they weren't just losing the mail, they were losing the battle. Not far from where those mail clerks were struggling, there was a squash court. This was one of the fancy perks for the first-class passengers. It was a beautiful room with high ceilings and polished wooden floors. But water doesn't care about luxury. While people upstairs were still wondering if they should put on a life vest, the squash court was turning into a swimming pool. Someone actually went down there to check on it and saw water bubbling up through the floorboards. It's a scary thought. One minute it's a place for a game, and the next it's a tank. The water was already several feet deep and rising every second. Every gallon of that cold Atlantic water was adding tons of weight to the front of the ship. It was like a giant hand was pressing down on the nose of the Titanic, forcing it deeper and deeper.
Up on the boat deck, the vibe was shifting from confusion to a sort of frantic, organized chaos. Captain Smith knew the ship was done for. He gave the order to get the lifeboats ready. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a lifeboat on a ship from back then, but they weren't just sitting there ready to be jumped into. They were covered in these thick, heavy white canvas sheets to protect them from the salt spray and the weather. They were tied down tight with heavy ropes. The crew had to jump into action. They pulled out knives and started hacking away at the lines. You'd hear the sound of canvas ripping and heavy ropes hitting the deck. These guys were working as fast as they could, tearing those covers off and tossing them aside. It was a massive job. They had to use these big metal cranes called davits to lift the boats up and swing them out over the side of the ship. This wasn't something you could do with a push of a button. It was all manual labor. You had groups of men hauling on ropes, cranking winches, and straining their muscles to move these heavy wooden boats. While they worked, they were shouting orders back and forth. The sound of metal grinding on metal filled the air. If you were a passenger standing nearby, you couldn't ignore it anymore. You'd see these sailors sweating in the freezing night air, desperately trying to get these boats into position. You'd look at the front of the ship and see that the deck was slanting down so much that the front railing was getting closer and closer to the water. That's when the reality of the situation really started to sink in for the people watching. They saw the crew stripping those boats and realized this wasn't a drill. It wasn't a precaution. The ship was actually going down. You can imagine standing there, holding on to a railing because the deck is slanted, watching a sailor struggle with a knot in a rope. You'd realize that your life depended on those few small wooden boats and how fast these men could get them ready. The front of the ship was dipping lower. The mailroom was gone, the squash court was filled with water, and the clock was ticking. The crew was working with a sense of urgency that you only see when things are truly falling apart. They were clearing the decks, making room for the crowds they knew were coming. The fun and games were over. The physical shape of the ship had changed so much that you couldn't pretend everything was fine. You were standing on a sinking giant, and the only way off was being uncovered right in front of your eyes. The crew kept at it, cutting ropes and swinging those davits out, knowing that every second they spent on a stubborn knot was a second the ship didn't have to spare. They were preparing for the worst, and for the first time that night, the passengers were starting to understand just how bad the worst was actually going to be. So, you have to picture what's happening on that deck. The realization is finally setting in. The crew isn't just playing a drill. They aren't just being cautious. This is happening. But here's the thing that's hard to wrap your head around. Even though the ship was sinking, the deck was actually the quietest place to be for a while. You had this weird contrast. You had the roar of the steam venting out of the funnels, this deafening, screaming noise that made it impossible to hear the person standing right next to you. And then you had this eerie, calm order starting to form. The crew started clearing the boats. Now, you've probably heard of the women and children first rule. It sounds like a noble, simple thing, but on the Titanic, it was a mess. It wasn't a law. It was more like an order that got interpreted differently depending on who was standing in front of you. See, the ship was divided. You had Officer Lightoller on the port side, that's the left side, and Officer Murdoch on the starboard side, the right. Lightoller was a stickler. If there were no more women standing around a boat, he'd rather lower it half empty than let a man jump in. He actually turned men away at gunpoint later on. But Murdoch, over on the right side, was a bit more practical. He figured if the boat had space and no women were ready to get in, why let the seat go to waste? He let men on. So your chance of surviving that night literally came down to which side of the deck you decided to walk toward. It was a total coin toss. While the officers were trying to get people into these boats, they were facing a math problem that was honestly a nightmare. I want you to really think about these numbers for a second. There were roughly 2,200 people on that ship. Between the rich folks in first class and the immigrants in steerage, everyone was in the same boat, literally. But the Titanic only carried 20 lifeboats. If you filled every single one of those boats to the absolute limit, you could only save 1,178 people. That means before the first boat even touched the water, over 1,000 people were already dead. There was no version of this story where everyone got off. And the crazy part? The White Star Line wasn't even breaking the law. The safety rules back then were ancient. They were based on the weight of the ship, not how many people were on it. The Board of Trade thought a ship this big wouldn't sink fast, so the boats were just there to ferry people back and forth to a rescue ship. They never imagined a scenario where the ship just went down in the middle of nowhere. So the crew starts loading. Imagine the scene. It's freezing. The deck is starting to slant just a little bit, enough that you feel it in your knees. You're looking at these wooden boats hanging from these big metal arms called davits. They look tiny. They look flimsy. And below them is a 70-foot drop into black, icy water. The first boat they focused on was lifeboat number 7. This was on the starboard side. It was about 12:40 in the morning. Now, you'd think people would be fighting to get in, right? But they weren't. You have to remember the Titanic was still warm. It was bright. It was huge. It felt solid.
People looked at that little wooden boat dangling over the edge, and then looked back at the massive luxury liner behind them, and they stayed put. They actually joked about it. The crew was getting frustrated. They were yelling for women to step forward, but a lot of wives didn't want to leave their husbands. They'd spent their whole lives together. They weren't about to start a solo journey in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic. So everyone just stood there, hands in their pockets, breath fogging up in the air, waiting for someone else to make the first move. Eventually, they got a few people to budge, a couple of first-class passengers, some starlets, a few guys who saw the writing on the wall. They lowered Lifeboat 7 down the side of the ship. It creaked and groaned the whole way down. The ropes were brand new, so they were stiff and hard to work with. The sailors were sweating despite the cold, trying to keep the boat level so it didn't tip and dump everyone into the ocean. When Lifeboat 7 finally hit the water and rode away, I want you to remember that math problem again. That boat was built to hold 65 people. It had been tested for it. It was sturdy enough to take the weight. But as it drifted away into the dark, away from the lights of the Titanic, there were only 28 people inside. Think about that. They had 65 seats, and they only used 28. They left with 37 empty spots, while 1,000 people back on that deck were basically waiting for a death sentence. The very first boat to leave the ship was more than half empty. It was a waste of life before the real tragedy had even started. The crew didn't want to wait. They were scared the boat would buckle if it was too heavy, or they were just in a massive rush because they could feel the ship getting lower and lower in the water. They didn't have a plan. They hadn't even done a lifeboat drill during the whole trip. The sailors didn't know which boats they were assigned to. The passengers didn't know where to go. It was just a group of people trying to figure out how to survive in real time, and they were failing the test. As that first boat disappeared into the blackness, The people left on the deck started to realize that the safe ship wasn't so safe anymore. The music was still playing. The band had moved out onto the deck to keep people calm, but the tune was starting to feel a lot more like a funeral march. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in, and the math was only getting worse. For every boat that left half empty, the odds for everyone else left on the deck were dropping to 0. And the water? It was still coming. It didn't care about the rules, the class of your ticket, or how many empty seats were rowing away into the night. It just kept climbing.
That water didn't just crawl up the stairs. It claimed the ship. And if you think it was a quiet, sad moment, you're wrong. It was loud. It was actually so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. The engineers had to vent the steam from the boilers so the whole ship wouldn't blow up like a bomb. Imagine a dozen freight trains screaming right in your ear. That's what it was. Huge, thick clouds of white steam roared out of the funnels and into the night sky. You had to scream just to tell someone your name. Most people just gave up trying to talk. They used hand signals or just grabbed onto each other. It was a mechanical nightmare. While that roar was going on, the crew started bringing out rockets. These weren't for a celebration. They were distress signals. Every few minutes, a crewman would fire one off. There'd be a massive bang, a flash of light, and a white streak would shoot way up into the dark. For a second, that flash would light up the whole deck. You'd see hundreds of faces, all pale and terrified, looking up at the sky. Then it would go black again. They weren't just firing them for fun. They could see the lights of another ship on the horizon. It was close. It was right there. They kept firing those rockets, hoping that ship would see them and turn around. They waited for a signal back, but it never came. That ship just sat there while the Titanic's bow started to dip lower and lower into the freezing ocean. Down on the deck, things were getting desperate. The women and children first rule wasn't just a polite suggestion anymore. It was the law of the ship. The crew started swinging the lifeboats out over the side. If you were a man standing there with your family, this was the moment your life changed forever. The sailors were shouting over the roar of the steam, trying to get people to move, but a lot of people were scared to get into the boats. Think about it. You're looking at a tiny wooden boat dangling 60 feet above a black, freezing ocean. The ship you're standing on is supposed to be unsinkable. It feels solid, even if it is leaning. Why would you jump into a rowboat? But then the water reached the top of the stairs. It started washing across the deck tiles. That's when the reality hit. The crew began grabbing women by the arms and helping them over the rail. I want you to picture being one of those guys. You've spent your whole life protecting your family. Now a stranger is pulling your wife away from you. You look at the boat and you see there are only a few seats left. You look at the officer in charge and he shakes his head. No men, he says. Or maybe he just points his revolver at the crowd to keep the peace. What did these guys do? They didn't start a riot. Most of them did something much harder. They stepped back. They kissed their wives goodbye, whispered something they hoped would be remembered, and then they just let go. They helped their kids into the boats and stepped away into the crowd. They didn't cry or scream. They just stood there on the deck, adjusted their hats, and watched their families lower down into the dark. They knew exactly what was coming. They knew that once that boat hit the water and rowed away, they were never going to see those people again. The boats were leaving half empty at first because of the confusion. Some held 20 people when they could have held 60. The crew was in such a rush to get them off the ship before it tipped too far that they didn't fill the seats. People on the deck watched those empty seats float away and realized their chances were getting smaller by the minute. The tilt was getting worse now. You couldn't walk straight anymore. You had to hang on to the railing or the side of a cabin just to stay upright. The floor was turning into a slide. And the noise of the steam finally stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. Now you could hear the ship itself. You could hear the heavy furniture sliding around inside the rooms below your feet. You could hear the glass breaking as the pressure from the water smashed the windows. You could hear the wood of the grand staircase splintering. Every time the ship groaned, it felt like it was complaining about the weight of the water it was carrying. The crew was still working, though. They were trying to get the last few boats ready, but the ship was leaning so far forward that the pulleys weren't working right. The boats were scraping against the side of the hull. One boat almost got dropped right on top of another one because the ropes got stuck. People were starting to scramble toward the back of the ship, trying to stay away from the water as long as they could. It was like a slow-motion race where the finish line was the freezing Atlantic. The band was still playing, too. They moved out onto the deck. They didn't play upbeat music to keep people happy. They played tunes that everyone knew, trying to keep the panic from turning into a stampede. Imagine trying to play a violin while the floor is slanted at 30 degrees and the water is 10 feet away from your shoes. They stayed there, right in the middle of it all, playing while the men who stayed behind stood in groups. Some of them lit cigarettes. Some of them shook hands with friends they'd only met a few days before. They were all just waiting for the end of the song. By now, the bridge, where the captain usually stands, was starting to go under. The water was swirling around the legs of the lifeboats that were still left on the deck. People were jumping now. Some tried to swim for the boats that had already left, but the water was so cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 knives the second you touched it. Most people just stayed on the deck, moving higher and higher as the front of the ship disappeared. They huddled together, strangers holding on to strangers as the Titanic gave up its fight and started its final dive. The lights were still on, glowing a weird dim red as the engines struggled to stay alive under the pressure, but everyone knew the power was going to cut out any second. The deck was crowded, the boats were gone, and the ocean was coming for everyone who was left. So the power is flickering, and everyone knows the end is coming. Imagine standing there on that deck. You look around and see that the big wooden lifeboats are all gone. They've been lowered into the dark, and all that's left are hundreds of people staring at the black water. You're stuck. The math just doesn't work out in your favor. But the crew isn't done yet. They have to try something. They had these last few boats, but they weren't easy to get to. While this is happening, the front of the ship is dipping lower and lower. It's not a slow thing anymore. It's happening fast. You can actually see the water crawling up the deck boards. It's coming for you. At the front of the ship, the water starts pouring over the railing and onto the open deck. People are scrambling back, trying to stay dry, but there's nowhere left to go but up. The ship is basically a giant ramp at this point. If you let go of a railing, you're sliding down into the ocean. Down by the last few boats, things are getting ugly. People are terrified. They see the water at their feet, and they see those last few spots in the boats. Some of the men decide they aren't going to just stand there and wait to drown. They start to push. They start to crowd the officers who are trying to get the last women and children into the boats. This is when the crew had to make a hard choice. Officers like Lowe and Murdoch actually pulled out their revolvers. They didn't want to use them, but they had to keep the crowd back. You'd hear these loud cracks, gunshots echoing off the steel. They fired into the air and shouted at the men to stay back. They told them they'd shoot anyone who tried to jump in out of turn. It was the only way to keep the boats from being rushed and flipped over. It was pure chaos, but that show of force was the only thing keeping any kind of order. Now you have to look at the roof of the officers' quarters. That's the highest point near the front. Tucked away up there were two special boats called collapsibles. Think of them like big rafts with heavy canvas sides that you could snap into place. They were Boat A and Boat B. The problem was they weren't sitting on the deck where they could be easily reached. They were strapped down on the roof. The crew didn't have cranes for these. They didn't have an easy way to get them down. So picture these guys, like Light Toller and some of the sailors, climbing up there while the ship is literally sinking under them. They don't have time to be careful. They find some spare oars and lean them against the wall of the deckhouse to make a sort of ramp. They cut the heavy ropes holding the boats down. Then they try to slide these massive, heavy things down the oars and onto the main deck. It's a total mess. Boat B, one of the big ones, slides down and flips over. It lands flat on its back on the deck. They don't have the time or the strength to flip it over. Meanwhile, the ocean isn't waiting. It's moving faster than the men can work. The ocean reaches the bridge. That's the room where the captain steers the ship. It just swallows it. Then the water rushes onto the boat deck, where everyone is standing. It's not a leak, it's a wave. This huge surge of water just sweeps across the deck. I want you to think about what that looked like. You're trying to untie a boat, and suddenly a wall of freezing water hits you. It picks up everything. It picks up the deck chairs. It picks up the people. And it picks up those two collapsible boats that the crew was just working on. Boat B, the one that landed upside down, just gets swept off into the ocean. It's floating there like a giant overturned bowl. People are jumping into the water and trying to climb onto the bottom of it. They're sliding off the slippery wood, trying to find a handhold, while the ship sinks right next to them. Then you have Boat A. The water picked it up and washed it off the deck, too. It stayed right side up, but it wasn't in good shape. The canvas sides weren't even snapped up yet, so as it's floating away, it's filling up with water. It's basically a bathtub floating in the middle of the ocean. People are swimming toward it, desperate to get out of the freezing cold, and they're pulling themselves over the sides. But because the sides are down, the boat is sitting so low in the water that it's almost underwater itself. The crew did what they could, but the ocean was just too fast. They never got to load those boats the right way. They never got to lower them with cranes. The sea just took them. You had hundreds of people left on the deck as the water kept rising. At this point, the front of the ship is completely underwater. The people who were standing by those boats are now swimming for their lives. You've got the officers still trying to do their jobs even as they're being swept away. Some of them are blown off the ship by air pressure coming up from the vents. It's a loud, terrifying sound, like a roar. The water is pushing the air out of the ship so fast that it's exploding through the hatches. If you were there, you'd see the lifeboats that did get away pulling into the distance. You'd be looking at the back of the ship, which is starting to tilt up high into the air. The lights are still on, but they're dim and red. You're in the water, or you're about to be, and those two rafts are the only things left floating near you. One is upside down, and one is full of water. That was the last chance for anyone left on that deck. The guys on the upside-down Boat B are standing on the hull, trying to balance so they don't flip it again. They're watching the ship they were just standing on disappear. There's no more shouting from the officers. There's no more gunshots. There's just the sound of the ship groaning under the weight of the water. The crew had worked until the very last second trying to get those collapsibles ready, but in the end, the ocean didn't give them those extra 5 minutes they needed. The water just moved in and claimed the deck, the boats, and everyone still standing there. You have to imagine the frustration of those sailors. They were right there. They had the boats untied. They had them on the deck. If they had just a little more time, they could have gotten dozens more people into those rafts. But the Titanic was done waiting.
The bow was heavy, the stern was rising, and the deck was becoming part of the ocean. Everything that wasn't bolted down was gone. The boats were floating away, empty or broken, and the people were left to figure out how to survive in water that was below freezing. It wasn't a hero's ending for those last boats. It was just a frantic, wet scramble as the sea took over the whole story. And once the sea takes over, the clock starts ticking faster than anyone is ready for. It's 2:18 a.m. now. If you were standing on the deck or watching from one of those tiny lifeboats, you'd notice something terrifying. The one thing that made the night feel even a little bit safe, the lights, started to fail. For the last couple of hours, the engineers down in the belly of the ship had been working like crazy to keep those generators running. They were waist-deep in freezing water, just so the people on deck wouldn't have to face the dark. But you can't fight the ocean forever. The lights didn't just snap off like a light switch. They flickered. They turned a weird, dim red color. Then, finally, they just quit. Imagine that for a second. You're in the middle of the North Atlantic, miles from anything, and suddenly it's pitch black. The only thing you can hear is the screaming and the sound of water rushing into the rooms below. Now that the power is gone, the ship is just a massive, dead piece of steel. And that steel is under more pressure than it was ever built to handle. The front of the Titanic is completely underwater by now. It's filled with thousands of tons of the ocean. That weight is pulling the nose of the ship down, deeper and deeper. But the back of the ship, it's still full of air. That air wants to stay on top. So you have the front pulling down and the back pushing up. This puts a massive amount of stress right on the middle of the ship. Think about it like a long stick. If you hold both ends and try to bend it over your knee, it's going to snap. That's exactly what started to happen to the biggest ship in the world. The ship wasn't designed to have its back end hanging out of the water like that. The keel, which is basically the spine of the ship at the very bottom, started to buckle. It couldn't hold the weight of the stern, the back half, lifting into the air. If you were there, you wouldn't just see it, you'd hear it. It sounded like huge explosions or giant trees snapping in half. It was the sound of thousands of steel rivets, those metal pins holding the ship together, popping out one by one. It was the sound of thick steel plates tearing like they were made of paper. As the ship started to bend, the third smokestack couldn't stay upright anymore. The wires holding it snapped, and that massive hunk of metal crashed down into the water, right on top of people who were trying to swim away. Then, right between the third and fourth smokestacks, the Titanic just gave up. The middle of the ship ripped open. It started from the top deck and tore all the way down to the bottom. For a few seconds, the ship was in two huge pieces, held together by nothing but some of the heavy machinery and the steel at the very bottom. The front half,
The bow was already so full of water that it just kept going. It started to sink toward the bottom of the ocean, but because it was still slightly attached to the back half, it did something unexpected. As the front half sank, it acted like an anchor. It pulled the back half of the ship up. It dragged the stern from a slanted position until it was standing straight up and down in the water.
If you were on that back section, your world just turned 90 degrees. One minute, you're standing on a deck that's slanted. The next minute, you're clinging to a railing like it's a ladder, looking straight down into the black water 100 feet below you. The propellers, those giant bronze fans that usually push the ship through the water, were now hundreds of feet in the air, pointing at the stars. The front half finally tore completely away and headed for the sea floor. Now the back half was on its own. For a minute or two, it just stayed there. It was like a skyscraper sticking out of the ocean. People were falling off, sliding down the decks, and hitting the water. But the stern didn't just stay floating. The end where the ship had broken open was a gaping hole. Water started pouring into that hole. As the water filled up the back half, the air inside had nowhere to go. It started blowing out of the ship with a loud roar. It was a physical struggle between the air trying to get out and the water trying to get in. The stern started to settle back down a little bit, leveling out as it got heavier and heavier. It didn't take long. Once the air was gone, there was nothing left to keep it afloat. Slowly, almost gracefully, the back half of the Titanic started to slide backward. It wasn't a fast crash, it was just a steady movement into the deep. The water rose up the sides, covered the very last bit of the railing, and then it was gone. The surface of the ocean closed over it at 2:20 a.m. 2 hours and 40 minutes after hitting the iceberg, the ship was completely gone. But the story didn't end when the ship went under. In fact, for the people still in the water, the worst part was just beginning. The ocean was flat and quiet again, but it was filled with hundreds of people who were suddenly realizing that the lifeboats weren't coming back for them. The big, safe ship they thought was unsinkable was now 2 miles down on the bottom of the ocean, and they were left in the dark, in water so cold it felt like being stabbed by 1,000 needles. The ship didn't just sink, it self-destructed. It fought itself until it broke. The engineering that was supposed to make it the safest thing on the planet actually made its final moments more violent. Because the bulkheads were so strong and the air was trapped so well, the ship had to tear itself apart to get to the bottom. It wasn't a clean exit. It was a messy, loud, and brutal end for the most famous ship in history. And when that last bit of the stern went under, the only thing left was the sound of the people left behind. The ship was out of the picture, but the disaster was far from over. Everyone who survived that night would remember that specific moment, the moment the black water finally took the last piece of the Titanic and left them alone in the middle of the sea. And then, just like that, the ship was gone. The thing you have to understand is that it didn't just sink quietly. When the stern finally went under, it left over 1,500 people bobbing in the middle of the North Atlantic. For a second, there was this weird, haunting silence, but it didn't last. Pretty soon, the air was filled with the sound of people screaming for help. If you were on the deck toward the end, you had 2 choices, and neither of them was good. You could stay on the ship until the very last second and let the water pick you up, or you could jump. A lot of people chose to jump. They climbed over the railing at the back of the ship, which was sticking way up into the air by then, and they just leaped into the dark. Some of them fell 100 feet. Think about that. That is like jumping off a 10-story building in the middle of the night.
When they hit the water, things went wrong immediately. You see, everyone was wearing these life belts, but these weren't like the soft, puffy life jackets we have now. They were made of hard, heavy blocks of cork. They were stiff as boards. So imagine jumping from that height. Your body hits the water and keeps going down because of gravity. But that cork, it wants to float. It stays right on the surface. So when these people hit the water, the life belt slammed up under their chins at full speed. It was like getting hit in the face with a sledgehammer. It broke people's necks instantly. It smashed jaws. A lot of people who survived the fall were knocked out cold the second they hit the ocean. Other people didn't jump. They tried to slide down the side of the ship or walk down the deck as it tilted. But the deck was covered in grease and soot from the funnels. It was slick. People were sliding and crashing into each other, hitting the railings or the equipment on the way down. By the time they actually reached the water, they were already bruised and broken. Then there was the water itself. This wasn't just cold water. It was 28 degrees. Now, you probably know that fresh water freezes at 32 degrees, but salt water is different. It can get colder than that without turning into ice. So the ocean that night was literally 4 degrees below the freezing point. When you jump into water that cold, your body does something called the gasp reflex. You can't help it. Your lungs just snap open and you take a huge breath. If your head is underwater when that happens, you're going to drown in about 5 seconds. For the people who didn't drown immediately, the cold felt like knives. It didn't just feel chilly, it felt like their skin was on fire. Your heart starts racing, trying to keep you warm, but it can't keep up. Your muscles start to get stiff. Within just a few minutes, most people couldn't even move their fingers to grab onto a rope or a piece of wood. And there was plenty of wood to grab. The Titanic was basically a giant floating city, and when it broke apart, all the stuff inside came spilling out. The water was filled with debris. There were thousands of wooden white deck chairs floating everywhere. There were doors that had been ripped off their hinges. There were pieces of the grand staircase, crates of food, and even huge chunks of cork insulation from the refrigerated rooms. People were frantic. They were swimming toward anything that looked like it might float. You'd see 5 or 6 people all trying to climb onto the same door, but those doors weren't meant to hold that much weight. They would flip over and everyone would fall back into the freezing water. It was a constant struggle just to keep your head up. Some people found the collapsible lifeboats that had floated off the deck upside down. These were basically big wooden rafts. People were crawling onto the bottom of these boats, but they were so slippery and the water was washing over them, so it was almost impossible to stay on. You have to imagine the scene. It's pitch black. The only light comes from the stars. You're in water that's literally freezing your blood, and you're surrounded by hundreds of people who are all doing the same thing, screaming and splashing and trying to find a way out. The debris was everywhere. You'd be swimming and suddenly get hit by a floating table or a piece of a piano. The people who were already in the lifeboats had rowed away. They were afraid that the ship would create a big suction when it went down and pull them under. Or they were afraid that the people in the water would swarm the boats and flip them over. So the survivors in the water were mostly on their own. They were looking at the lights of the lifeboats in the distance, calling out, but the boats didn't come back right away. The lifebelts were actually a problem here too. Because they were made of cork, they kept people's heads above the water even after they passed out from the cold. So you had hundreds of people just floating there, bobbing in the waves like corks. To someone in a lifeboat a few hundred yards away, it looked like a huge field of white dots on the water. The sound was the worst part. Survivors later said it didn't sound like individual voices. It sounded like one long, high-pitched hum.
It was the sound of 1,500 people realizing that the water was too cold and the boats were too far away. Think about the physical reality of it. You've just come from a warm, bright dining room or a cozy cabin. Now, 10 minutes later, you're fighting for your life in the dark. You're grabbing at a floating crate, but your hands are so cold they feel like wooden blocks. You can't feel your feet. You try to shout, but the cold has tightened your throat so much that only a whisper comes out. The debris field was huge. It spread out for hundreds of yards. It wasn't just wood and chairs either. There were personal items everywhere. Letters, hats, shoes, and even money were floating on the surface. It was all that was left of the lives these people had a few hours ago. Some people tried to swim toward the lifeboats, but the water was so cold that their arms just stopped working. They would get halfway there and then just stop. They would hang there in their lifebelts, watching the boats row further away. There were a few lucky ones who found big enough pieces of the ship to stay mostly out of the water. One guy managed to get on top of a large pantry cupboard. Another group found a large piece of the wooden wall from a first-class cabin. But most people were just in the water, chest deep, with the 28-degree ocean sucking the life out of them every second. The cork lifebelts, while they kept you afloat, were also very bulky. If you were trying to climb onto a piece of debris, the lifebelt would get in the way. It made you clumsy. If you fell off a piece of wood, the belt would pull you back up so fast that you'd swallow a gallon of salt water. Every minute that passed, the screaming got a little quieter. It wasn't because people were being saved. It was because the cold was doing its job. After about 15 or 20 minutes, the sounds started to fade away. The people who were still alive were too tired and too cold to make any more noise. They were just trying to breathe. In the dark, with the debris clattering against each other in the swell of the waves, it was a race against time. The people in the water knew that help wasn't coming in minutes. It was going to be hours. And in 28-degree water, nobody has hours. All they had were those floating chairs, those broken doors, and the hard cork belts that were keeping them from sinking, but couldn't keep them from freezing. It was a desperate, messy, and violent struggle for every single person who hit that water. So the ship was gone. Just imagine that for a second. 1 minute, you're looking at the biggest, most expensive thing humans had ever built, and the next, it's just gone. It disappeared into the water and left nothing behind but a huge, dark hole in the middle of the ocean. But the ocean wasn't empty, not even close. There were about 1,500 people left in that water. I want you to think about that number. That's a lot of people. It's a whole town's worth of people, all dumped into water that was actually below freezing. Now, you'd think the people in the lifeboats would have turned around immediately. I mean, they were right there. Most of the boats weren't even full. They had plenty of room. But that's not what happened. As soon as the Titanic went under, the people in the boats did something that seems impossible to us now. They rowed away. They heard the screaming, they saw the splashing, and they pulled on those oars as hard as they could to get distance between themselves and the people dying in the water. I know what you're thinking. How could they do that? How could you sit in a boat with empty seats and listen to people beg for their lives and just row away? Well, it wasn't because they were all monsters. It was because they were terrified. There was this huge fear that if they got too close to the swimmers, the people in the water would swarm the boat. They thought hundreds of desperate people would grab onto the sides all at once and flip the boat over. If that happened, everyone in the boat would end up in the water too. It was a cold, hard math problem for them.
They figured it was better for 700 people to live than for everyone to die. I've read the accounts from the people in those boats. They described the sound of the people in the water as a long, continuous roar. One survivor said it sounded like a crowd at a big football game back in England. You had 1,500 people all screaming at the same time, and it stayed that way for a long, long time. In some boats, people were arguing. You had women like Molly Brown in Boat 6 who were yelling at the crew to turn around. She was a tough lady, and she didn't care what the sailor in charge said. She wanted to go back. But the man in charge of her boat, Robert Hitchens, was scared out of his mind. He told everyone that if they went back, the swimmers would swamp them and they'd all drown. He even called the people in the water stiffs before they were even dead. Then you had Boat 1. This was a tiny boat that could hold 40 people, but it only had 12 people in it. 7 of those were crew members, and the rest were wealthy passengers like Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon. They were so close to the sinking that they could hear everything, but they didn't go back either. There was a lot of talk later about whether the rich people in that boat paid the crew not to go back. Whether that's true or not, the result was the same. They stayed away while people a few hundred yards were freezing to death. In the water, things were moving fast, and they weren't moving in a good way.
You have to understand what that kind of cold does to a human body. The water was about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That's colder than ice. When you hit water that cold, your body goes into total shock. You can't breathe right. Your muscles start to cramp up almost immediately. You're wearing those heavy cork life jackets, so you aren't sinking, but you're just bobbing there like a piece of wood. The people in the water were trying to find anything to climb onto. A few guys found a collapsible boat that had floated off the deck upside down. They climbed on top of it and spent the whole night balancing there, trying not to let it flip. Others found pieces of wood, doors, or crates, but most people were just floating in their lifebelts. They were waiting for the boats to come back. They kept calling out, hoping someone would hear them. But as the minutes went by, the screaming started to change. It got quieter. It went from a roar to a moan, and then, eventually, it just became a few individual voices. While all this was happening, there was one man who actually tried to do something. His name was Harold Lowe. He was the 5th officer on the Titanic. He was in charge of Boat 14. Once the ship went down, Lowe didn't just row away and wait. He did something pretty smart. He gathered 4 other lifeboats together in the middle of the dark. He had them tie themselves to each other so they wouldn't drift apart. Then he started moving people. He took the passengers out of his boat and put them into the other boats. He wanted his boat to be empty so he could go back and pick up survivors without the risk of his boat sinking. But here's the thing. Even Lowe didn't go back right away. He waited. That's a polite way of saying he waited for most of them to die or become too weak to fight. He knew that if he went back while everyone was still strong and screaming, his boat would be overwhelmed. So he waited in the dark, listening to the noise, for about 45 minutes to an hour. Can you imagine being one of the people in the water during that hour? You're freezing. Your hands are numb. You can see the lifeboats in the distance, just sitting there. You're wondering why they aren't coming. You're watching the people around you stop moving. One by one, your friends or family members just go quiet. It wasn't like a movie where everyone has a big, dramatic goodbye. Most people just got tired. They got cold, they fell asleep, and they didn't wake up. By the time Officer Lowe finally decided it was safe to go back, the ocean was almost silent. He and his crew rowed Boat 14 back into the area where the ship had gone down. They had lanterns, but they didn't show much. They were rowing through a field of white objects. At first, they thought it was white rocks or pieces of ice. Then they realized it was the white life jackets on hundreds of dead bodies. They rowed through the bodies, looking for anyone who was still moving. It was a gruesome job. They had to push bodies out of the way to move the boat. They called out, but almost no one answered. Out of the 1,500 people who went into that water, Lowe only found 4 people still alive. Think about that. Only 4. One of them was a man named William Hoyt, but he died shortly after they pulled him into the boat. Another was a Chinese passenger who had tied himself to a door. He was almost dead, but he eventually recovered and even helped row the boat. The rescue mission didn't last long because there was no one left to rescue. The cold had done its work. The people in the other lifeboats just watched. They sat in their boats, some of them half empty, and waited for the sun to come up. They didn't talk much. Some people prayed. Some people just stared at the horizon. They were in the middle of the North Atlantic, miles from anywhere, in small wooden boats, surrounded by the bodies of the people they had been eating dinner with just a few hours before. They stayed like that for hours. The water was calm, which was the only reason those boats didn't sink. If there had been any waves, those small boats would have been in big trouble. But the sea stayed flat. They waited and they watched the stars. They knew help was coming because the radio operators had sent out the distress calls, but they didn't know when. They just knew they had to survive the night. It was a long, cold wait, and for most of them, the guilt of what they had just heard and seen was already starting to set in. They had made it out, but they had left everyone else behind. And that was a thought they were going to have to live with for the rest of their lives. That guilt was heavy. It was like a physical weight sitting in those lifeboats. You're alive, but you're staring at the spot where the biggest ship in the world just vanished, taking over 1,000 people with it. You're sitting in the dark, in the middle of the North Atlantic, and the silence is probably louder than the screaming was just a few minutes ago. You've got no idea if anyone is actually coming for you. You've got no idea if you're going to freeze to death before the sun even comes up. You're just a tiny speck on a black ocean. But then, right around 4 a.m., something changed. A few people in lifeboat number 2 spotted a light. At first, they thought it was just another star sitting low on the horizon. But this light was moving. It was moving fast. Then they saw it, a flash of a rocket. It wasn't a distress signal like the ones they'd been firing from the Titanic. This was a "we see you" signal. It was the Carpathia. Now, you have to understand what was happening on that ship while everyone in the water was praying for a miracle. The Carpathia was a much smaller ship than the Titanic, and it was heading the opposite way, toward Europe. It wasn't even supposed to be in the area. But their wireless operator, a guy named Harold Cottam, was incredibly lucky. He stayed on his headset just a few minutes longer than he usually did. He picked up the Titanic's CQD call. That's the old version of an SOS. And he didn't waste a second. He ran straight to the captain's cabin. Captain Arthur Rostron was asleep, but as soon as he heard the news, he didn't just give a lazy order and go back to bed. He jumped up and turned that ship around. He headed straight for the last known coordinates of the Titanic. Rostron was a man of action, and he knew the risks. There was ice everywhere, huge bergs that could sink his ship just as fast as they sank the Titanic. But he didn't slow down. He actually told his engineers to turn off the heat and the hot water in all the passenger cabins. He wanted every single ounce of steam to go to the engines.
He pushed the Carpathia to 17.5 knots. That ship was only rated for 14. He was literally redlining the engine to get to those survivors. He didn't care about the wear and tear. He cared about the people in the water. Back in the lifeboats, the mood shifted. They weren't just waiting to die anymore. They had a target. But the Carpathia didn't just pull up alongside them like a taxi. The sea was still full of ice. Rostron had to navigate through a literal minefield of white towers in the dark. Around 4 a.m., he stopped the engines. He was close. He fired a green flare into the air to let the lifeboats know exactly where he was. When the people in the boats saw that green light, they started rowing. And man, that wasn't easy. Think about it. You've been sitting in a cramped wooden boat for hours. It's below freezing. Your hands are so cold you can't even feel the wooden handle of the oar. Your muscles are stiff as rocks. But they rowed. They had to. They saw this massive wall of steel in front of them, lit up with electric lights, and it was the most beautiful thing they'd ever seen. Lifeboat number 2 was the first one to make it to the side of the Carpathia. They pulled up alongside this huge hull, and the crew of the Carpathia was looking down at them from the deck. They didn't have a gangplank they could just roll out. They didn't have a door they could just open at water level. They had to get these people up the side of the ship, and they had to do it while the ocean was still moving. The crew threw down rope ladders. These things are basically just 2 ropes with wooden slats for steps, and they swing wildly in the wind. If you're a young, fit guy, maybe that's not a big deal. But imagine you're a woman in a heavy wool dress that's soaked with water, or you're an older man who's been shivering for 4 hours. You have to grab onto those freezing ropes and pull yourself up, one step at a time, while the ocean tosses your little boat around below you. It was a struggle. People were slipping. Their fingers wouldn't work. For the people who couldn't climb, the Carpathia's crew had to get creative. They used bosun's chairs, which are basically just a piece of wood you sit on that gets hauled up by a rope. For the kids and the babies, they used canvas bags. They'd literally drop a mail sack down, tell a mother to put her baby inside, and then haul the sack up to the deck. Can you imagine the terror of watching your child swing over the open ocean in a bag? But it worked. One by one, they got them up. As each person hit the deck, the scene was intense. The Carpathia's crew was ready. They had been working for hours while the ship was racing toward the site. They had set up the dining rooms as makeshift hospitals. They had piles of blankets, gallons of hot coffee and soup waiting. But the first thing they did wasn't give them a drink. It was a count. The officers stood there with clipboards. They asked for names. They asked what class they were in. They were trying to build a picture of who was left. You had survivors walking onto the deck, wrapped in blankets, immediately turning around to look at the rail. They weren't looking at the ship. They were watching for the next boat. They were looking for their husbands or their fathers. They were sure the other boats would be right behind them. One boat would show up and they'd pull 20 people off. Then another would show up with 60. The sun started to come up around 4:30 a.m., and that's when the reality really hit. The light didn't bring more hope. It brought the truth. As the sun rose, the survivors on the deck of the Carpathia looked out over the water. They didn't see a fleet of boats. They saw ice, miles and miles of ice, and in between the ice, they saw empty water. The counting continued. The officers were checking off names, but the lists were getting shorter and shorter. They realized pretty quickly that the math didn't add up. They knew how many people were on the Titanic. They knew how many lifeboats there were. By the time the last boat, Lifeboat 12, was emptied around 8:30 in the morning, the deck of the Carpathia was dead quiet. The crew went through the final numbers. Out of over 2,200 people who had been on that ship, they only counted 705. That was it.
The realization swept across the deck. People started crying, but a lot of them just stared. They looked at the Carpathia's crew, hoping they had missed a boat somewhere. Maybe there was another ship nearby, but there wasn't. Captain Rostron did one last sweep of the area. He cruised around for a few hours, looking for any sign of life. He found wreckage. He found white deck chairs floating in the water. He found some bodies in life jackets, but he didn't find any more survivors. Around 9 a.m., he realized his job was done. He had everyone he was going to get. He ordered the ship to turn toward New York. The Carpathia was now a ship of ghosts. It had its own passengers who had woken up to find their ship turned into a floating hospital. And it had the survivors who were sitting in the hallways and dining rooms, staring at nothing. The count was final. 705 people made it out. Everyone else was gone. And as the Carpathia steamed away from that ice field, the survivors were left with the cold, hard fact that their lives had changed forever in the span of just a few hours. They had been rescued, but the world they were going back to wasn't going to be the same one they left. You can imagine that boat ride to New York. It wasn't some happy homecoming. When the Carpathia finally pulled into the harbor on the night of April 18th, it was pouring rain. There was no sun to greet them. It felt like the whole city was out there on the docks, just waiting in the dark. The ship finally pulled up to Pier 54. I want you to picture the scene. Thousands of people were crowded behind iron fences, screaming out names and hoping for a miracle. When the survivors started walking down those wooden ramps, it was pure chaos. They walked into a sea of flashbulbs and pushy reporters. Some people had families waiting to wrap them in blankets and take them home. Others just stood there in borrowed clothes, staring at the crowd and looking for faces that simply weren't there. Most of them didn't have a penny to their names or a suitcase left. It was a grim sight. But the government didn't waste any time. They didn't even give these people 24 hours to go home and sleep. The very next morning, a man named Senator William Alden Smith started a massive investigation. He set it up right inside a fancy hotel called the Waldorf Astoria. He started calling witnesses immediately. He brought in the crew, the guys who owned the ship, and the survivors who had seen the whole thing go down. He grilled them for days. He wanted to know exactly why the ship was going so fast and why so many people died. He wasn't going to let the truth get buried at the bottom of the ocean. Because of those hearings, the world changed the rules for good. Before the Titanic, the law said ships only needed lifeboats based on how heavy the boat was, not how many people were actually on it. It sounds stupid now, but that's really how it worked. After this, they passed a law saying every single ship had to have enough spots in lifeboats for every person on board, period. They also realized they couldn't just turn off their radios at night. From then on, ships had to keep their wireless radios on 24 hours a day so they'd never miss a cry for help again. It was a heavy price to pay, but it made the sea a lot safer for the rest of us.